So today I wanted to speak to you about the recent Vijay Mallya interview that came out. He broke his long silence, and the media has been buzzing with old headlines and new hot takes. And I thought that it would be a little bit more meaningful for us to pivot. I wanted to discuss with you today less the person and more what this moment tells us about the broader climate of doing business in India. Um, for my first question, you often hear business people talk about how tough it is to get things moving in India, bureaucracy, red tape, all of that. But then you also have the World Bank saying that India has made some serious strides. In the 2020 report that they came out with, it was called Doing Business. They said that India was at the 63rd rank, um, which is almost 70 points ahead of the rank that we had in about 2014 when we were at 173rd. So what do you think is the disconnect here? Do you think all of these reforms and these rankings, are they really shifting things on the ground?
Anshula, like everything else in India, what you say can be true and untrue at the same time because there are so many layers in the country. If you look at the long-term trajectory since 1991, unquestionably things have improved because, first of all, there is economic freedom, there's competition, there's choice, there's encouragement to private sector compared to earlier days. There is much more deregulation now, and a whole lot of good things have happened. But it doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory. So the statement you made is absolutely accurate on both counts. Yes, there is improvement, but yes, there's a long way to go yet. Because while policy, at least in some of the more proactive states and at the union level, is generally encouraging of investment, sometimes bad policies, sometimes or most often at the grassroots level, the kind of predatory practices that we have, the extortionary corruption that we indulge in, and in some states, political corruption of a very high magnitude, expectation that you will fund them in order to do what is necessary to be done for the state. So I think it's a complicated picture. It varies from state to state, but things are improving, but a long way to go yet. We are nowhere near what we should be doing in order to achieve a sustained 8 to 9% growth rate for the next 20 years. That is our hope and expectation, right?
Got it. So, sir, for somebody who's just starting out, a first time or a first generation entrepreneur, without legacy capital or connections, what are some of the bigger roadblocks that they're still running into in India today?
I think in the technology era, things are improving a little bit because government is not involved. With a low capital, with a good idea, you can still move a project up to a point. And there is an ecosystem developing even in India, venture capitals, angel capitals, and so on and so forth. All kinds of things are happening. But in a broad sense, for a new entrepreneur without much resources and connections, it's definitely still a very difficult thing. Three things occur to me immediately. The first is access to credit. Now, our banking system has expanded considerably, but even today, access to credit for a good idea is not that easy unless you have considerable means and property to pledge, or you have political connections or bureaucratic connections that will put in a good word on your behalf with a bank or something. And bankers, in my judgment, are increasingly loath to funding good project on a small scale when they are not well connected. Banking has become more and more perfunctory rather than more and more purposive. And the banks are increasingly happy to lend to the governments on a fairly big scale in a variety of programs because then it is risk averse. You don't have to apply your professional judgment. I know I'm making very harsh statement about banking in India, but in general, the perception that we have is unless it's a government program or unless you are a big business person or unless government itself is borrowing from you, bankers are not particularly good at retail lending, particularly for projects of this kind. They may be doing a lot of lending for housing, for automobiles, and so on and so forth with regular EMIs. But project funding on a small scale for new entrepreneurs without any background or connections, I think still is a problem. The second is even venture capital and other mechanisms of raising capital for small players who are not very well connected is very difficult yet. The third is you still have infrastructural and linkage problems. An entrepreneur can do his or her job very well, but unless other linkages are available, it's always difficult to get things done. And finally, the regulatory things, even to register under, let's say, the GST Act or earlier sales tax, commercial tax registration, or register under some other law. Even today, while things have improved, they have not improved sufficiently. Still petty corruption, still harassment, still too many hurdles are there. Take Pollution Control Board. Now, nobody can argue that there is no need for regulation of environmental pollution. It is a social good. But I must be very candid, in many cases, that regulation has not really protected the environment. It is more a mechanism to stop the process and to extract some more money and so on and so forth. Almost every regulation in India, even if it's a desirable regulation, has become a source of corruption. So a combination of all these things are certainly hurting us, apart from infrastructural problems, like for instance, if you need some land for a manufacturing unit, acquisition of land is very difficult. Land is becoming more and more pricey. And therefore, unless we move to small towns, and that's what I would encourage the young people to do, and the entrepreneurs, don't think of the big cities. Go to small towns where cost is less, and increasingly now amenities are available. For instance, 25, 30 years ago, it was unthinkable that there was electricity in the village in the first place or a small town in the first place. Today, you have near 24-hour electricity in many small towns. Television was not there 20, 30 years ago. Then digital technology is not there. Even telephony was not there. All these are no longer a problem. Luckily, we have at least conquered some challenges. Therefore, small entrepreneurs, as far as practicable, I think if they go to small towns, regulatory problems may be less, the cost may be less, and the ability to recruit people at a relatively modest wage is much greater with the same productivity. So I think entrepreneurs also must look at smaller towns in order to make their task easier.
So, since you brought up this issue of land, I was wondering, land is such a central piece of doing business, especially in sectors like manufacturing. Do you think our current approach to private land ownership is helping or hurting? And what do you think about models like China's? Are there things that we can adapt to better support small and medium enterprises the way that they do over there?
Absolutely, Anshula. Everybody who has some exposure to China raves about that country in terms of encouraging investment. The biggest thing they talk about is how they created whatever you call them, either special economic zones or manufacturing zones or industrial estates or whatever. It's plug and play. Everything is ready. You don't have to worry. Land, water, regulatory things, digital connectivity, electricity, the effluent management, everything is set. You just can go and start. That's why even a company like Tesla, automobile manufacturing is a very complicated business. It took them about 9 months from the day they have decided to actually start manufacturing, which is a near miracle. That is the most important thing in terms of land. Apart from the labor and productivity we can discuss later, but land is a big constraint. Similarly, land ownership, even if you want to acquire private land, the Western societies have showed us that if land ownership is clearly documented, you don't have to worry about whether I'm purchasing legally or not, whether the person who is actually selling the land has the title or not. You don't have to worry at all. Everything is properly done because a registration of a sale deed is equal to a title. They figured out mechanisms. We have failed to do so. If you want to acquire property, the cost is now skyrocketing because we have created an artificial scarcity of land in India because of poor infrastructure and over-regulation. And two, we have not really ensured that the title and land records are very clear and transparent and reliable. And once land is not properly available, there's always a challenge. The third thing from an entrepreneur's point of view is even if you have your own private land, in the absence of proper documentation, in the absence of proper titles, to pledge the private land and get credit, because oftentimes it's the land, urban land, that is taken as security by the banks. The process is taking long and it's become very costly because from the banker's point of view, it's not verifiable easily. Therefore, they adapt to the costs. So I think land title anywhere in the world is one of the most important things. A very high quality of record system. We've been talking about it in India for a long time. Andhra Pradesh started a pilot project long back, I think called Mabhumi or something. It never really went far. When I was in Administrative Reforms Commission, I pursued it very vigorously, and I persuaded the government of India at that time to allocate some special funding for improvement of land records. Even recently, I read in papers, I think some 5,000 or 7,000 crores is allocated for land records in the states by the union government. So all these are happening, but it's very perfunctory. The real change required to improve the land record system, updating the land records, survey and settlement as we call it. For instance, in the colonial India during British time, every 30 years there was a regular survey of every square inch of land and what they called settlement. That means the title is recorded and final after a due process. At a time when there was no technology, there were no resources, in primitive conditions of infrastructure, they did that. Post-independence, not a single state in India has undertaken a full survey of its land or settlement. Not a single state. So, our land record keeping, that too is a big challenge. So, I think there are simple low-hanging fruit. And whatever money you invest, actually government gets multiples in terms of revenue, apart from economic activity and taxes later on. So, this is an absolutely vital thing of general administration or basic administration in states. And I think increasingly the basic core functions of the government are neglected in pursuit of either areas where you can rake in money to predatory corruption, or increasing focus is now devoted to short-term individual welfare in search for the votes. But the long-term economic growth and the real things that are required to make growth happen and investment happen, I think they are generally speaking relegated to the background in our country.
I wanted to circle back, sir, to what you were saying about banking. Do you think that the line that we draw between a failed business and a fraudulent one, do you think we as a country, are we still struggling to separate business risk from criminal wrongdoing? Do you think we're too quick to punish failure?
I think it's a great question, Anshula. I haven't followed Mr. Vijay Mallya's interview, but from what the team briefed me, this is one of the key points that he was making. And I completely agree with that. You know, I want to go back a little bit into history of corporates in the world. If I recall rightly, the first limited liability company, public company, incorporated was the Dutch East India Company. I think way back in the year 1600, if I'm not mistaken. We, of course, know about the British East India Company. Now, why did limited liability company arise? Because as industrialization was beginning to happen, or investment and risk-taking was beginning to happen beyond agriculture, human society realized that these ventures could fail. They're risky ventures. Now, why would I take any risk? Because there is a possibility of reward. Even if there is a risk of failure, if I do well, if I succeed, the reward is great. And therefore, human beings are willing to experiment. They become bold. They're willing to take a risk. They're willing to innovate. And they will take a chance. Now, supposing your failure in business for no fault of yours leads to bankruptcy and collapse of your family, you will not take a risk. Because survival is the first mode, right? For all of us, the first order of priority in life is survival. Survival of the family. So, the basic idea of the corporate structure is that A, liability is limited, and B, in a competitive market economy, unless you create a monopoly, artificial monopoly, and unless you create an artificial administered price which guarantees profits, in a competitive economy, Some enterprises will succeed, some will fail. Now, the success may be because you're good at marketing. It may be because what you are supplying may not be the best thing, but it actually conforms to the fashions of the day or the tastes of the day. Now, take for instance some food industries. McDonald's. I don't mean to be disparaging, but I don't think it's the best food in terms of your health. But they're popular. A, they knew how to brand themselves and market themselves. And B, the people's tastes, however unhealthy they are, conform to McDonald's. Or take cigarettes. Nobody in the right mind says cigarette is a good thing, tobacco smoking is a good thing. But tobacco companies for decades made huge profits. So, it's not always that success depends on the best product. It may be a relatively bad product for the person who is consuming it, but marketing is done well, or the people's fashions and tastes and their lifestyles support it. Or sometimes, in a competitive environment, if roughly equal products are there, some products may not really take off for a variety of reasons. So failure is inevitable. Sometimes the product may not work as much as you hope also. So competitive market economy means fundamentally there are two trade-offs that we are accepting. The trade-off from the entrepreneur point of view is failure is sometimes inevitable. If 100 try, maybe only 10, 15 succeed, the other 80 will not really go far. And therefore we'll protect them from the consequences of failure in terms of personal life and family life. That is limited liability company. The second trade-off is that in the competitive market economy, everybody becomes more prosperous because a rising tide lifts all boats, but it doesn't mean that everybody rises equally. There's unequal growth. The people who are entrepreneurs who have succeeded, or certain technologies where there's a takeoff. For instance, you take the digital technologies now, world over there are only 5 or 6 major companies that have become big players. 20, 25 years ago, they were unknown, they were unheard of. But they are the biggest companies today. Because that aggregation effect is much greater in digital technologies. So, certain people will rise very fast. They become very prosperous. But other people will also rise. Their prosperity will not increase that fast. So, while overall prosperity increases, the quality of life improves and poverty comes down, perhaps inequality also is inbuilt into the system. That is what market economy is about. Now, if we allow ourselves to be conditioned by hatred for the people who create wealth, who become prosperous, then we are actually cutting the nose to spite the face. It is to our detriment. It's true, Tesla is making a lot of money, and Elon Musk has now become the richest man on earth. It's true, Amazon made a lot of money, and Amazon founder is one of the richest people on earth. It's true, Microsoft made a lot of money, and Bill Gates is one of the richest people on earth. Now, they are not our enemies. They became rich because they sold a product which we think is valuable. They supplied to you goods and services that you think you need. And you have consciously bought something from A rather than B because that's the product you wanted. You believe that's the best value for the money, or you like the product, or it fulfills your needs, or whatever be the reason. So the consumer is not fleeced. The producer is not a crook. The notion that anybody making money is a crook is a very dangerous notion. Unfortunately, in our socialist mumbo-jumbo, license, permit, control, Raj, we somehow created a framework in which people at large, those in power and the general public, are made to believe that creating wealth or making money is a sin. It is something wrong. If you create goods and services that are necessary for the consumption of the bulk of the people, then you're doing something very noble and vital. That is true wealth. But if you collected a bribe, or if you damage the public interest by adding to the pollution without conforming to the standards, or cheating people with a substandard product, or bribed officials to sell something substandard and fleece the exchequer, that is sinful. That is criminal. But genuine entrepreneurship, genuine enterprise, risk-taking, or noble activities. A wise society encourages them. We will not be governed by envy. We will be governed by a deep understanding of what's happening. At the same time, when something wrong happens, whether it's pollution, or cheating the consumers, or robbing the exchequer, that certainly is a criminal activity. You must be ruthless about it. Somehow in India, societies like India, where market economy has not been encouraged for a variety of reasons early on, I think we still are struggling with this concept. We somehow equate making money with being sinful or being criminal or something. Therefore, we have to completely change that attitude. Unless we respect entrepreneurs, the risk takers, our economy will not grow, will not create jobs, our needs will not be fulfilled, our prosperity will not increase, our quality of life will continue to be stagnant.
Sir, what you were saying about these big players like Microsoft and Amazon, I was just wondering, do you think that as a country we're overly relying into these big names? Do you think we should be moving away from such a model? And are there economies that you think that we could learn from when it comes to smarter regulation and healthier business ecosystems that allows the small player to thrive as well?
Anshula, it's not one or the other. Let me recount a sexist anecdote. Pardon me for that. I believe a very difficult mother-in-law, she died. She was difficult and she was a nag, and the son-in-law suffered a great deal. But when the son-in-law was abroad, a friend called and said, "Look, your mother-in-law died." And this man jumped with joy. Then he asked him, "Look, it will take time for you to come back. We cannot keep the body until that time. Shall we bury her, burn her, or embalm her?" The son-in-law said, "Do all three. Don't take any chances. She might come back." So in industrial promotion and economic growth, you don't have one option. Whatever big investment is possible from within the country or abroad, we must embrace that. Gone are the days when you believe that anybody investing in your country is a colonial fellow who is trying to fleece. Actually, we want investment instead of debt. The other option is debt. Right, you have to borrow. And by not investing in your country and producing, you are basically forced to buy things from abroad. That means you are actually employing the workers in other countries and you're paying them instead of economy growing in your country, instead of your people getting the benefit, instead of you getting the employment. So investment is always better than debt or reckless imports. Whoever they are, wherever they are from, we need them. But obviously that's limited, right? Other countries also are competing, and you cannot get only from abroad. That's only one part of it. Because the real benefit of investment from abroad is not so much money, it is technology. It is practices. It is global market penetration because they have the skills and the network. It's not merely money. So the real thing will happen through our own investment. And in countries like India, while we are not as good as China, savings ratio is reasonable. It's actually declining. China is much more in terms of savings. But we do have some significant savings compared to the rich countries, OECD countries. So that money must be deployed productively into investment. And there again, not merely big. We require our Tatas, we require our Ambanis, we require Adanis, we require our JSW, we require the Birlas, we require all these. But we require more and more small and medium industries. Because world over, it is they that provide the largest employment, that are the biggest promoters of exports. Take China. Even today, if I'm not mistaken, about 40% exports are through small industries and medium industries. And there's integrated supply chain. So unless the small and medium industries flourish, employment will not be generated, wealth will not spread to spread outside the big cities, and technology will not really benefit the ordinary people. So it's not one or the other. We require all the above. And big industry is easier in a way if the industry makes a decision for their own reasons, because first of all, they have the ability to make informed decisions. And they will basically make the countries bid. or within India, let's say the states bid, whoever gives them the best deal or best business opportunities, they would like to come. But it's the small ones who require the government's sympathetic understanding, bureaucracy's support. And that's where we're lacking. Because of a glamour quotient, when a big entrepreneur from abroad, primarily from multinational abroad, or some of the big players in India come, the whole bureaucracy and the political leadership is after them. Good. But when small people, they want to invest, they want to do something, nobody seems to care. Now they have to go after the bureaucracy and the political leadership. It's a terrible model. We have to encourage entrepreneurship in India across the board. And the more small and medium enterprises come up and the more they succeed, the better it is for the country, because then wealth is spread much more equitably, more employment is generated, and there is much more harmonious, balanced indigenous growth, because you can have an island of excellence through an MNC in a big company, but the prosperity does not go beyond their workers and themselves. Technology also may not go beyond a point. So we require all three at every level: global investment, national investment from the big players, but most of all, small and medium players across the board in all sectors.
Got it. Sir, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the big player in India. If we zoom out a little bit, there's this pattern that we've seen over and over where we see these big players, they have big defaults, huge bailouts, and often very little accountability. How much of this is about individual bad actors, and how much of it is about deeper issues like cronyism or systemic corruption?
First of all, let's look at the big picture. In about 2015-16, because of aggressive lending and somewhat careless lending, and also because of the 2008 onwards global financial crisis, the banking sector was in deep crisis in India. If I'm not mistaken, the default rate was very high. Non-performing assets were very high at the time, exceeding 10 percentage points in case of many banks. There was a cumulative loss, annual loss, combined loss, not cumulative, combined loss in the public sector banks alone of the order of about 100,000 to 110,000 crores per year. And India had to put in from the exchequer, the union government, from the tax money, we had to fund to a tune of more than 4 lakh crores, I think about 4.8 lakh crores, if I'm not mistaken, over the next 4 or 5 years in terms of capital adequacy. Now, 10 years down the line, things have improved remarkably. I don't remember offhand the latest numbers in terms of non-performing assets, but they are now very manageable, I think 2 to 3% in most of the banks. There's a combined profit of about 70 to 80,000 crores or 100,000 crores in public sector banks, as opposed to losses of 110,000 crores per year. And the banking sector is very robust right now. So what does it mean? That means defaults have come down, non-performing assets have come down, and where defaults are inevitable, money could not be recovered, because of the government support and banks' own reserves and profits, they have written off those so that the banks have a healthy balance sheet. So first of all, let's not despair. Things are actually improving, and we must maintain that improved status. That's the important thing. Second, to the extent that the defaults do happen or there are non-performing assets, we are getting confused about 2 or 3 things. The first confusion is the moment a non-performing asset is stated, there are prudential norms of banking by which RBI demands that a certain percentage of these non-performing assets you must write off, you must assume that they are not recoverable, and therefore make adequate provision of capital from the reserves. So that does not mean that the money is lost. Oftentimes, with aggressive efforts, money is recovered later, either because the company has improved its financial performance, came out of difficulties and is able to repay, or the bank is able to recover from the assets of the company later on. We also have done things like, bankruptcy code. Now it's working better. There's a lot more room for improvement. And there's also a mechanism now available in the country for the sick industries which are no longer functioning or which are no longer able to generate any surpluses, for them to be transferred to, those assets to be transferred to some others and managed better. So You are doing many things to be able to make the company survive and the banks get back the money. That's the first confusion. Not everything mentioned in the NPAs is lost. The second thing is, as you said rightly, there is a confusion between the legitimate business laws we discussed earlier. In a market economy, capitalist economy, in a competitive economy, the very basis of competition is some people will succeed, some people will fail in the market. Legitimate market failures are not cheating. They are not fleecing. They are not deception. They are genuine risks. Now, in a sensible economy, when there's risk, let's say 1 or 2%, the economy absorbs it. You take, for instance, the much reviled railroads in the 1830s and 40s or 1800 thereabout in Britain, America, railroad companies, in many old films even now, they're the big villains in those days because they appropriated land and did this and that. But many of those companies lost money. The man who built the last leg of the London Metro from America, he lost money, he became bankrupt. Similarly, the people who built the digital infrastructure, the fiberglass cabling and so on and so forth, they lost big time money. The society gains. There is no immediate money available. Or big infrastructure projects. Oftentimes investors lose money. Take L&T, which built in Hyderabad a good quality metro of 69 kilometers, costing about 24,000 crores capital today, I think, maybe including interest during construction or whatever. But they're making losses. Now, can you say L&T therefore fleeced the money? No. They made a business decision. While it's good for Hyderabad city and the public, it's not good for the company. They lost the money. So unless we understand legitimate losses are part of market economy and business risks and respect them and create a mechanism by which they don't pay the price, the company does not get shut down automatically because of that. It will be a disaster for the country because nobody will invest. And if the company's management has failed to perform well, the best way to do, and we have not done it enough, that's where I think India should improve. We allowed the entrepreneur to continue, whoever is the founder. We continue to allow him to have the majority stake and continue the management control. That's wrong. In case of Satchem, for instance, when something wrong happened, the government did the right thing. They transferred it to another entity. They forced the promoter out. That must be the norm. Increasingly, I think that's not being done. That's the right approach. Finally, there's an outright fraud. That is where criminality is involved. You must punish them. But confusing between outright fraud and legitimate business loss is, I think, a foolish thing. And it's largely born out of a socialist mindset of over-regulation and license permit control Raj, delegitimizing economic freedom and individual enterprise, and glorifying the inefficient and mostly corrupt public sector with guaranteed monopolies, administered price system, and very poor quality. You take the automobile sector, for instance, take any sector. Wherever government put its finger, they have failed spectacularly. So it's not a wise idea. And even the good public sector companies, like HMT, for instance, supplied the best watches. In my life, I only had 3 watches. The first 2 were HMT watches. Ultimately, I had to give up the HMT because the repairman said, look, 20 years ago, the company shut down. You still have HMT watch. We're not able to repair. Please change it. So even a good company ultimately collapses with a monopoly. Unless private sector is encouraged, unless we understand competition and risk-taking and respect risk-taking and investment, the country will really continue to flounder. Poverty will be perpetuated. That's what happened in this country for decades. We must never commit that mistake. That does not mean we condone deliberate fraud or fleecing of the exchequer or the bank's money. That must be dealt with separately. And there is a lot of confusion in India between legitimate business risk and fleecing the bank or cheating the public.
I said that was really well said, sir. And I think this is a great note to end our conversation on today. Thank you so much for taking out the time to sit with me and to discuss this.